Most people do not know that the first great test of federal power was over whiskey and taxes. In fact, it was the first federal tax in our young nation's history. This tax on whiskey was a little different than how we are taxed today in the fact that people were taxed on the manufacturing and not the sale of the product. And since it was a regressive tax, the larger the still, the lower the tax. Now, the Federalists, with most of the political power at the time, saw this as a luxury tax and therefore did not think it would anger the common citizen. So it was passed in 1791 as the excise whiskey tax. What the politicians in Philadelphia did not understand was that many frontier families in western Pennsylvania farmed their land and used the excess grain to distill whiskey. In fact, many farmers used the majority of the grain for the manufacturing of whiskey because it was more profitable and easier to transport over the crude roads and difficult mountains than grain was. Additionally, because currency and gold was rare in the backwoods, some even used it for bartering and trading. Because they could not increase their production capacity, the profits were soon eaten up in taxes. Not only were the profits hit by the tax, but they were easily undercut by the large eastern distilleries because their stills were much larger and they did not have to pay the transportation fees the small western Pennsylvania farmers had to. To make matters worse, they had to pay the tax in cash, a commodity that was scarce west of the Allegheny Mountains. Eventually, feeling the weight of the tax, many farmers felt their way of life was being threatened by the far-away elitist government in Philadelphia that favored wealthy landowners. They felt, what was the difference between a despotic king and a despotic president? Nothing. So to protest, western Pennsylvania farmers refused to register their stills, and the local tax collectors were threatened and assaulted. An example of this is in the case of tax collector Robert Johnson. He had his horse and his clothing stolen, his hair was cut off, and was tarred and feathered by a band of farmers poorly disguised as Indians. Eventually, more and more protests turned violent, and militias were actually formed to protect the stills from the tax collectors. It all came to a head in July of 1794 when tax collector and Revolutionary War General John Neville shot a protester. Within a day, over 700 anti-tax militia surrounded his house, far outnumbering Neville, his few slaves, and the 10 soldiers that were sent to escort him to safety. In the fighting that followed, 3 militiamen and 1 soldier was killed, with the rest of the Neville group made prisoner. By early August, nearly 7,000 anti-tax militia had formed near Pittsburgh and started to make plans to attack the city. In an effort to buy time, the city's government asked for negotiations, while Governor Mifflin, the governor of Pennsylvania, issued a proclamation asking for federal troops to intervene. Now, before this, deciding that federal authority had to be enforced, President Washington asked for and was given the authority to raise troops to suppress the rebellion. Soon, almost 13,000 federal troops, mostly Virginia militia, began their march towards Pittsburgh with President Washington at their head. As Washington and his army closed in on Pittsburgh, the anti-tax militia, frightened by the size of the federal army, began to disperse, with the leaders heading to the western fringes of the frontier. In the end, only 10 rebels stood trial, with only 2 convicted for treason, of which, to the strong disapproval of Hamilton, Washington soon pardoned them. In 1802, President Jefferson eventually repealed the tax. Of note is that this is the first and only time a sitting president ever marched at the head of troops to an armed conflict, and also the first of ever presidential pardons. Thank you for your time.